Got it.
Okay, now
Here
begin.
are here's the slides. Hopefully you all can see that. Thank you all so much for having me this evening at my house, but at various times where you are. I'm excited to share this talk on ecology and society. The goal really is to provide some considerations for what sport can look like, what we as sport people could do as our planet is changing. Hopefully, I leave you with a few practical takeaways as well. And I did my best to cater everything to relevant sports for this audience, but if there are questions otherwise, I'm happy to field those as well. So a little bit about me. I'm an assistant professor. I teach and study in sport management. I'm a member of the Sport Ecology group. And so we're a research consortium studying the intersection of sport and the natural environment. I'm a scuba diver. I've been diving for, what is this, 2024? So I've been diving for 15 years. Um, in 23, I was named to the Forbes 30 under 30 list in sports. I love animals. My dog Clyde is sitting at my feet right now. These are the things that drive me personally and professionally. My background in sport looks a bit like this, from participating in my younger days through many injuries to working in the field and engaging in my passions between sport, recreation, my hobbies as a diver, being an environmentalist. Just occupying time and space outside has been really important to me and has shaped my research. Speaking of research, my field is called sport ecology, like I said, and we study the bidirectional relationship between sport and the natural environment, which really just means that sport is affected by the environment, but also plays a role on the environment itself as an industry. And so it looks kind of like this two-way street of bidirectional. It has a linear connotation. I would argue that it doesn't have a linear relationship. There's some overlap there, and some nuances that can further complicate the role that sport plays in society and in the environment. So where those areas overlap is where a lot of my research falls, and will be kind of the focus of our talk today. So within that field, I've sort of illustrated it at a macro level. The things that I hope to do within sport ecology is to determine if and how sport can be leveraged for climate action. And in doing so, I aim to present climate hazards and solutions to people and organizations, and very importantly, use sport as a tool to disseminate the realities of climate injustice. And this is a global problem. It will be so long as we have people and sports around the world. And so there's no shortage of opportunities to sort of get plugged in and try to affect positive change. So the guiding research question for me that really everything that I do sort of points back to is presented here. And to start to find some of the answers to this question, I look in these four sort of sub buckets. And each of the four will kind of be pointed to as we move through this presentation, but just to sort of, again, illustrate from a bigger level down to a more pinpointed version, this is how I spend my time and energy as a researcher to try to solve some big global problems, but through the sports that we all enjoy. So the focus that I really want to drive home today for this talk is on ecological justice, really the injustices. So you probably have heard environmental justice. There's also climate justice. We can break them down a little bit further, but to lump them together, I'll call them ecological justice and issues of ecological injustice. So what's really happening is that there are climate and environmental hazards, harms, and risks around the world. These things are affecting everyone, but they don't affect everyone equally or at the same rates. Disproportionate harms that make certain people, communities, regions, classes, socioeconomic statuses more susceptible than others. There are stratified versions of reality, and that is equally true when it comes to the environment. And the disparities that exist is environmental or climate injustice. And so we can think of this as, there are the haves and have-nots in society. And so who's affected primarily are the historically marginalized communities. And this will look different geographically, by nation, by culture. Even and we can break it down by sport in have and have not. We can break it down by gender, ability, and age. There are ecological vulnerabilities that are reinforced by society's isms. So genderism, sexism, racism, ageism. All of the isms are tools that we can use to separate people. And there are some variations in the lived experiences by those isms as well. So we're all living in a world that's becoming increasingly unlivable due to conditions of our climate, but that rate at which it is becoming unlivable is different. And a lot of that points back to the privilege and opportunity of those who have it. So what this looks like, because this, that is a big sort of socio-cultural thing that I just threw at you. What this looks like in sport specifically, here are some examples of unequal realities, and I'll explain them at the macro level, and then we'll apply them to sport after. This one is particularly relevant for the skating community, the urban heat island effect. Historically, redline neighborhoods are today's intra-urban heat islands. So they're little, I won't call them an oasis because it's not nearly as pleasant, but where these are areas where residents can experience hotter air and surface temperatures based on the heat islands of the region. These are areas that are usually our inner cities that have a lot of concrete and asphalt and not a lot of green space, tree cover, natural ways to absorb the heat. Climate gentrification. This can be broken down a lot further than the elevation hypothesis, but there's gentrification that exists based on humans' abilities to make choices. The ability to make choices often comes down to the amount of privilege. The elevation hypothesis basically says that property values, which include homes, appreciate in areas that are situated in higher elevation neighborhoods or regions. And as somebody who grew up camping, and I've seen, countless kids, or I was a scout growing up, choose to pitch their tent at the bottom of the hill, knowing, me personally, knowing that if it's going to rain, those are going to be the first tents to get wiped out. I would always try to pitch my tent at on the highest point of our campsite. And so that's essentially what the elevation hypothesis says, that homes, that neighborhoods, schools, corporations that are situated higher topographically appreciate at a higher rate. And so I think of places like the Hollywood Hills. There's a reason why these homes are sitting up high. Income buffers the exposures to climate hazards. Except now we're living in a world where mudslides are a very real thing. So maybe those at the top will come sliding down and we'll all be on equal playing fields. We'll see. Finally, intergenerational injustices. So indigenous communities and communities of color carry disparities through generations. It is a source of historical trauma. What this means in sport is that those experiences that might not be lived by an individual person, but that person belongs to this community, could carry the burden and the trauma of those experiences. So indigenous and Black and brown communities suffer unintentional drowning fatalities and road cycling deaths at rates higher than their white counterparts. And even if an individual person, you or I, we haven't drowned unintentionally and we haven't suffered a catastrophic cycling injury, just knowing that our ancestors or our loved ones could have experienced that, might have been exposed to something that traumatizing, could prevent us from engaging in swimming, in entering the water, or learning how to ride a bike. And so those things are passed down. They're learned over time. And this has really been extensively studied, particularly in drowning, but in other areas that can illustrate that there are barriers to the natural environment, again, reinforced by existing societal isms. So I teased sport a little bit in the last one, but let's dig into what this means a little bit further. There are some key areas of for the sport community that are like implications. First, access. So all of the barriers, the hardships, the things that I've outlined, they influence access to sport. These environmental and climate injustices limit equitable access. So it might not limit access entirely, but it might limit equitable ones. So access could mean our neighborhoods have cycling lanes, but the cycling lane in my neighborhood might be narrow in roads that need to be repaved. There's no street lights. It's pretty dangerous. Cycling paths in other neighborhoods might be wider. They might have physical buffers with the resources to sort of implement barriers from automotive vehicles. They might be well lit. They might have reflectors, things like that. So equitable access or inequitable access further drives the wedge between the haves and the have-nots. In addition to access, there are implications for opportunity. Those who are most susceptible to injustices face diminishing opportunities to enjoy sport for all of the reasons already mentioned, but that also means a reduction in the opportunity for the co-benefits of sport. Those things like your physical well-being, mental health, opportunities to make friends, to get active, to try something new, to spend some time outside, to engage in competition and teamwork. All of those are the bonuses that extend beyond just competing or playing recreationally. Climate change is a threat multiplier. So if the opportunity for sport is diminished because of climate, then the threat of, cardiovascular health issues later in life goes up. The toll of being inside all day because our air quality is poor and we don't have safe places to play will then continue to have or continue to compound and have effects on a person's life. And so this also leads into well-being. Climate and environmental injustices affect physical and mental health. Those things combined influence other elements of well-being like nutrition, hydration, and hygiene. So as we continue to see our climate harm people around the world, it's not just a matter of, oh, it's hot. This is just going to mean more for our air conditioning, or the way that we make decisions on how we spend the day because it's too hot. It will also influence those other elements that are really important to being whole, healthy people. So in some of the regards that I study this in sport, and I'll move through this rather quickly, we see injustices and we see effects of climate show up in winter sport access. Pictured here is the largest public skate lane. It's in Canada. The last like 2 or 3 winters, it has been forced to shut down, simply because it's been really warm and the ice isn't freezing for people to skate. So the park officials have to make those tough decisions on whether or not to close down this park. And this stretches, it's huge. I should have used a map of how far it is, but I also wanted you to see just how crowded it can be because it is so popular and it's free. So when you think about access and opportunity, it's great that this is a free way for people to strap some skates on and learn. If you look closely, you'll see that there's people on the ground. So people have definitely fallen. I'm sure there are some all-star skaters out there that can do jumps and turns and tricks. But this levels the playing field for a lot of people. However, despite it being free, the access is diminished when the entire park has to close, regardless of a person's income or ability to pay for it if it was associated with a cost. But when it shuts down, it just shows there are so many people who now don't have access to skating. And for something like this to be so popular and to be free, this is how a lot of people learn to skate. This is where they learn to skate. This is how they travel from one part of town to another. They just kind of hop on this belt line and zip away. But then that gets immediately yanked away from them when it has to close because it's slushy. It's not freezing solid. Hazardous weather or extreme weather is another area of interest for me. If you take all of the water out of this picture, that was a baseball stadium. You could kind of see just the outline of it. Flooding and other catastrophic consequences of extreme weather events like earthquakes, wildfires, typhoons, hurricanes, even severe thunderstorms and blizzards really just show how we interact with climate on a daily basis. These events become more popular or more not popular, more frequent and more severe. So events like this will become more of a norm. It still seems rather shocking to see images like this. But at some point in the probably near future, that won't be the case. What I do want to illustrate with this photo, though, is that this isn't just a baseball stadium that is underwater. This is an illustration of a public health crisis, contamination issues for potable water and food. It's also a safety hazard for all of the electrical outlets that have been damaged and destroyed. There are so many implications for human health in this one picture alone that extends beyond, oh, well, now we can't have our baseball game. It's a lot more serious than that. Extreme heat. Those of you who are in Australia, this is nothing new for you. In the US, same here. Major implications for human health and well-being. Extreme heat is becoming a silent killer of athletes of all ages and of all playing levels, from children to the most elite, which is really scary. It's not talked about nearly enough in sporting spaces. I think many of us might have taken for granted the opportunities that we've gotten to have in engaging in sport outside. But the reality is that those same kids now that won't learn how to skate on the public ice skating lane will now also face increased hazards by spending time in the summer, in the sun, because what it feels like to be outside has holistically changed. Hydration, pre-existing conditions, and other first aid, more emergency situations are becoming greater issues and greater priorities. But again, back to the notion of the haves and have-nots, not every community or grassroots sport organization or school will have the infrastructure to deal with someone who's suffering from heat stroke or heat illness, even severe sunburn, especially when dealing with volunteers, maybe parents who are the coaches or officials for team sports that they might not have the training, they might not have the equipment. And for those reasons, we're seeing an uptick in hospitalizations, even death, especially among children, which is really disheartening. Conversations in sport can oftentimes focus on those who are at the most elite levels of sport. But if we don't focus our attention on those who are learning, those who are kids, and are in the developmental stage, those conversations on elite athletes and major sporting events will cease to continue. Air quality, I teased this one a bit earlier. This one is also not, is becoming less restricted to certain parts of the world, and regions of the world that were previously unfamiliar with the realities of poor air quality are experiencing them. Whether that air quality is due to industry or due to wildfire. And there can be a whole host of other causes of poor air quality, but we're really seeing the pollution show up in our air to the point where it's visible, and that's very scary. Again, thinking about how it takes a whole healthy person to play and enjoy sport, but without drinkable water and breathable air, again, we can really see how the opportunities would be diminishing from a participation and consumption standpoint. There's not a sport that I would want to see if the sky ever looked like this. So, keeping those examples in mind, the reality is, and these are just examples, it's not exhaustive, and most of them come from the work that I do. Extreme heat is the leading cause of death and disability of high school athletes. So, high schoolers in North America, these are children generally between the ages of 13 and 18. Extreme heat is taking them out of school, is taking them out of sport, and more frequently is becoming a major cause of death. Heat illness, injuries, and deaths, though, due to extreme heat, are 100% preventable. They can be stopped, they can be avoided. They absolutely do not have to happen, but an understanding of our climate and the physiological effects of climate on the human body, especially on a young person, is going to be really critical in preventing these instances from happening in the future. Children, women, and people of color face greater harms due to changing ecologies. This includes social system changes like education and health equity, which again points back to how disparities persist, and they're not limited to the felt realities of climate change, but because the climate is changing, that influence social systems like education, health, reproductive well-being, even opportunities to earn a living. Those choices will then cease to become choices, but have profound implications on what's possible for certain people to do. And so those isms, again, that I mentioned, separate the haves and have-nots. They're ongoing. They're nested in society. They're also legitimized by the sport industry. This means that as long as these disparities exist, those lines of inequality will influence who gets exposed to the hazards and who gets protected from them. So I also want to talk about what Sport for Nature is doing to try to address and rectify this. There is evidence of sport organizations, participants, notable figures engaging in the protection of nature and conservation. This isn't a new concept, but we're talking about it a lot now because it's getting to the point where we have no choice but to talk about it. Sport ecology research is growing to explore the environmental efforts and responsibilities. And a lot of this focuses on environmental sustainability, but it's also growing in climate change and climate action, which is exciting. So you might be familiar with the United Nations Sport for Climate Action framework to set up the sports sector for engaging in climate action in ways that make sense for their organizations, to provide that sort of institutional support for the organizations that do wish to address it. However, and while it's great, it should be noted that the Sport for Climate Action framework was a first step, and it was a very promising one to sort of rally the troops. It is fundamentally incomplete. The UN suggests that we are living through a triple planetary crisis. This extends beyond climate change and includes air pollution and biodiversity loss. And these are the three main interlinking issues facing humanity at the present moment. Human activity drives all of these. The consequences all roll together and contribute to that rate in which Earth is becoming unlivable. Extreme weather-related deaths are on the rise. There are over 22 million climate displaced people around the world. Climate change, air pollution, and biodiversity loss contribute to chronic and communicable disease, as well as economic downfall and political strife. I read online somewhere that if there were to ever be another world war, it would be caused by the compounded consequences of this triple planetary crisis. There will be a lot to fight over if clean water, air, food, safe places to live become so scarce that those kinds of choices would have to be made. And so UNEP sort of addresses this and how we can reimagine what our planet looks like, and consider the relationships of those three crises as they sort of all tumble together. So, and going back to sport, the goal is to set up what the next step is and elevate discussions around the role of sport in protecting and preserving nature, since the buck doesn't stop at simply addressing climate change for the sake of climate action. And this is where the Sports for Nature baseline report and framework have come in. The and that QR code should take you right to the framework if you're interested. The framework itself was designed to complement the Sports for Climate Action framework, but with one major objective, which is to deliver transformative nature positive action across sports by 2030 and into the future. Within that one objective, there are 4 principles. I'll break these down further as well. Protect nature, avoid damage, restore and regenerate nature, understand and reduce risks to nature, and educate and inspire positive action, all of which can be achieved through sport, and the framework aims to address how. The framework's broken down into 4 physical environments, in addition to the 4 principles. The 4 shared environments are water, urban, mountain, and field. For the skating population, that's an urban environment. But this is just a way to categorize sport so that the organizations that have a shared environment can collaborate, can come up with solutions that are applicable for other organizations that are similar to them, or for sports that are similar to them. So far, half of the signatories to the framework are situated in the water environment, but that's a good thing because it means the awareness and nature stewardship is already present in that shared environment. There are opportunities to grow them in urban, mountain, and field. there's an opportunity for equity here because the Sport for Nature framework acknowledges that climate action isn't feasible, nor is it the responsibility of all people. This goes back to the disparities present regarding ecological injustice. And so this is really situating nature at the forefront to kind of get at the pieces of the triple planetary crisis that are overlooked with the Sport for Climate Action framework. By centralizing nature, the framework was informed in part by indigenous knowledge and service-based leadership, which is really encouraging to see that take more of a central role in sport-related decision-making. These are things that are often lost or disregarded. So those 4 principles that I mentioned of the Sport for Nature framework, but applied specifically to surfing and skating. That first one, protecting nature and avoiding damage. This, for these organizations or these people or even brands, there's an opportunity here to assess how the sports affect nature and how they depend on nature. And there's an opportunity also to examine how the sports engage in or encourage natural relations as they're being developed, whether that's in the construction of a built environment or even the site location for an event, and sort of choosing how these events come to be. Nature can be centered at the forefront of those decisions. The second principle on restoring and regeneration, Surfing's We Are One Ocean initiative can appreciate the relationship that the sport has with the natural environment, but also ascribe this sense of responsibility to sort of mitigate the harm that it does innately by forming concentrations of people that are utilizing and using natural resources, and then in return, take an opportunity to restore wetlands, coastlines, dunes, reefs, things like that. There are some growing initiatives in skateboarding on recycling boards, trucks, wheels. And so there's also more and more, I'm seeing this more frequently, a little bit more consideration of the environment and the development of skating opportunities. So even though it's in an urban environment, there's this movement now that's centralizing art in the skate movement and greenscaping in the skate movement. So natural shaded areas, parks, gardens, water features, things that kind of undo the things that contribute to the urban heat island effect and can bring more of nature back into these often just largely concrete spaces. Oops. Principle 3 is understanding and reducing risks in the supply chains. So this is how the sport came to be, how it continues to be. The sports sector is all about consumption and the use of resources. And so the consideration here is on the trade-off between meeting the supply and demand needs of the sport, but also evaluating the role that nature plays in continual growth of the sport. So we do want to see increased participation, increased opportunity, increased diversity and inclusion. But at the same time, we also want to make sure that these efforts aren't overtaking the necessary conservation work from an environmental standpoint. And then finally, principle 4, educating and inspiring, which should be fairly easy to do because people who are outspoken about the environment and their sport by nature automatically educate and inspire positive action. But there is an opportunity to improve environmental connection through sport that every person can engage in. It's possible to foster environmental stewardship through sport. That's been studied heavily. There's already a few educational initiatives there's even more branding opportunity, and I'll talk about that as well. Some examples to follow, because there are organizations that are already doing the work, are listed here. There are countless others, but these are some that have already signed off on the framework and have demonstrated their commitment to this type of engagement, which is really exciting. It's growing as we speak. It's new, but people are on board, which is it's good to see. Things like this don't have time to be around for decades before people invest. We simply don't have that kind of time. So to see this sort of buy-in from major events, major federations, should be very encouraging. So some examples in surfing and skating: the World Surf League and Coral Gardeners in French Polynesia. What I want to point out about this relationship is that it extended over time. So in 2019, this partnership grew with the purpose of raising awareness about reefs, but also in an effort to restore reefs in French Polynesia around the Tahiti Pro. But what's more important is that in 2019 isn't where the story ended. In 2021, these teams, along with the coral gardeners, came back and took the coral microfragments that they either grew or that they restored onto areas of degraded existing reef to bolster its chances of survival. From a scientific standpoint, this process has proven to be really successful for coral reef resilience. So to get surfers involved in that process was really exciting. To see the commitment extend over multiple years, including the pandemic, is also really encouraging. The Natural Selection Tour, Climate Commitments, and Protect Our Winter Athletes. This partnership between POW and the NS Tour really showed that there's this commitment between an environmental organization centered around sport and a sporting event. This collaboration sort of was catalyzed by a goal to reduce carbon emissions, but it ended up being an opportunity to support, advocate, and educate around environmental sustainability as a whole, and climate action in the winter sports. It integrated environmental education and advocacy into the tour's broadcasting and programming. So people will listen to athletes, to broadcast as they watch and engage in sporting events. This is oftentimes more well received than listening to the climate scientists talk about the same exact things. And Element Skateboards partnered with 1% for the Planet and donated 1% of their sales capital. That money goes directly to 1% for the Planet's forest protection initiatives. And those initiatives include mitigating deforestation, but also reforestation and forest education. In 2023, so last year, Element became an official member of Engage for the Planet, which is based in France. It's a branch of the World Wildlife Fund. So they are also tackling biodiversity loss and the importance of tree coverage, which is great for the very reason that I mentioned about skating being an urban sport, but can tie directly to efforts that don't necessarily directly translate to the sport. So I don't automatically think reforestation when I think of skateboards, but this is a really good opportunity for those brands to collaborate and work together. The funds from Element Skateboards and Engage for the Planet can aid experts and non-governmental organizations in their work against deforestation, and doing so can sort of circumvent and address that biodiversity loss. The skateboards come from trees, but when someone purchases a board or they go out to ride, it's not necessarily an automatic click that what my feet are touching right now once was a tree. So there's an opportunity there to educate and to foster that connection to the natural environment. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work that has been done, but some of the things that we can do right now, first, take a load off. I'm hopeful that the examples presented here can be inspiring and show everyone that they're not in it alone, that these collaborations, projects, and partnerships do exist. So there's an opportunity to collaborate with other like-minded organizations or those who have signed on to the framework as a commitment to addressing these pressing crises around the world that have this shared mission and likely shared values. But they also demonstrate centralizing decolonial and indigenous efforts to promote justice in and for nature and people. There are so many out there who believe this is important and that this would be critical to the advancement of sport and humanity. And so we can all tip our hats to those efforts and respect the work that's already happening while we look for ways to get involved ourselves. There's also an opportunity to sign and learn more about the framework. If you all have questions, and if I can't answer them, I can at least point you in the right direction. But there's also innovative opportunities to take home for yourselves and ideas for future work. 5 of them here, I will just sort of briefly run through them. First, if we situate ourselves around a world that's more just and equitable for people and subsequently for sport, we can reimagine what sport looks like. Presented here is Zeb Powell. He's won a bunch of X Games medals, like golds and silvers. He's very young. He's a Black kid from North Carolina. Oftentimes he doesn't see anyone who looks like him in his sport, on the mountains, at the X Games. But if we focus on a more just world and more just sporting opportunities, he wouldn't have to be one of one in these spaces. The faces like this will become more commonplace in sports where historically, these are communities that have been intentionally excluded from snow sports and from the mountains themselves. We can reassess our policies and procedures for addressing environmental and climate hazards, whether that's something that could be as brief as a lightning-related delay at a sporting event, all the way to things that are more long-term and more catastrophic, like the flooding image that I showed you earlier. We can also reassess what it looks like to host major events. For example, we're losing access to cities that were once viable to host the Winter Olympic Games. Over half of them are no longer viable. They don't meet the necessary coldness criteria. So even though we've pivoted from high 90% to 100% artificial snow, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Producing snow will be extremely costly and more detrimental to the environment than having the games. And so we'll get to a point where these kinds of decisions will determine whether or not these major sporting events like the Olympic Games, like World Cups, whether or not they'll continue to happen. Or if they do continue to happen, they might happen less frequently. We can challenge the status quo and the norm in sport. This example is from the film Remember the Titans, but we don't have to just accept that sport and people who engage in sport are supposed to be tough and have grit and persevere, because we don't live in a world that is compatible with that kind of mindset. Water breaks are okay. Taking time to sit in the shade or go inside or stop or reschedule or postpone or cancel entirely will have to be okay when it's down to the matter of life and death, which for so many people, unfortunately, it already has been. So we don't necessarily have to accept that sport and the associated conditions are worth pushing through. As a result, we can also intervene, and as responsible people, step in to make responsible and right decisions. So this example here is from my hometown. Unfortunately, a girls basketball player passed away due to heat illness. And unlike most similar cases that end up in civil court, they charge the coaches or the administration with negligence or wrongful death. This was the first case that levied criminal charges against the coaches and held them responsible for pushing the girls through these types of extreme conditions to the point of death for one. And this took the actions of a mourning, responsible family and others to really make sure that the message gets across that this simply isn't okay. It was absolutely preventable and shouldn't happen to any other kid or their family as well. Finally, we can employ environmental empathy, cultural empathy, scientific knowledge, inclusion as it pertains to the environment, protection and safety for all people, so that sport can remain this fun, inclusive opportunity that brings people together, that allows them to try something new, to make new friends. If what we think of as sport, this fun thing, it is a great unifier. It's a language that's spoken around the world. For sport to remain this powerful tool to inspire, we have to make sure that all people belong and have a space to engage. And so much of that comes down to our decisions and what we do with our natural environment. And so I recognize that that was a lot. I've compiled a list of resources. You can scan the QR code. You don't need to read it now. You could save it for later. But I mentioned that there are Indigenous communities, there are women, there's the disabled communities, there's global, there's like groups of mothers around the world that are all working in similar efforts to promote inclusivity in sport while also amplifying climate action, conservation, biodiversity, environmental protection, just to show none of us are alone in these efforts. There's a lot of work to do, but we should be inspired by the work that's already happening. And that, I believe, is all that I have for you all today. And I really appreciate your time. Would love to take any questions that you have.
Okay, I'm going to thank you so much, Jessica, for such an amazing talk. We are just so fortunate to have you as a speaker and running us through so much really, really vital information. It's really conversation in skateboarding that is just emerging, and it's really great to have that input from the sports ecology approach. Firstly, I'm going to actually throw to Ben if he's here. And Ben's going to facilitate some of the question time.
I am here. Thank you very much.
And oh, sorry, I'm going to stop recording as well for the question time.